next season.
Call the meeting to order, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending the meeting of the Dissolution Committee for the former Board of Dallas County Schools Trustees. Thank all of you again for your attendance. Appreciate your being here this morning. First order of business, if you would, we'd like to stand and have our Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. This morning we have I think a fairly full agenda, and I know that all of you have probably had a chance to look at the items. I think that Mr. King has been very busy, and I'm going to start and let him bring items to our attention. The first item we have on the agenda is the approval of minutes for the meeting that was held November 15th, 2017. Are there any changes, corrections to the minutes? Yes, sir. Mr. Dransfield.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, on item C, the canvassing of this, I'm wondering if we ought to just add that you've got here DCS election results were canvassed November the 11th, and I wonder if we ought to add something like, and consequently no action was taken by the Dissolution Committee, just so it doesn't give the impression that we were doing something before we were empowered to be acting.
Any objection to that language being added? Okay, if we can get that language added. Any other? Did you have another?
No.
Any other amendment or change? Hearing none, all in favor of the minutes, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? The minutes are approved. The next item on the agenda, item B, is consider authority approval letters to settle insurance claims and litigation suits. I'm sure this will be the first of these. This will probably be the only one of these we'll see, but Mr. King, I'm going to turn this item over to you and let you lead us in the discussion and recommendation.
We basically have to settle litigation claims for our auto liability policy, and we're requesting your approval to settle at the limits prescribed here. This will allow us to conduct safe and dependable transportation for our districts. Any questions?
You want to speak to those limits for just a minute? Those are, I think...
15,000 would be handled by our risk manager. 15 to 50 would be addressed by me, and above 50 would come to this committee for consideration.
I believe that's on page 8 of your agenda. And I take it that's your recommendation?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Do I hear a motion? Move approval. Got a motion?
Second.
Have a second by Mr. City, motion by Dr. Hinojosa, second by Mr. City. Any discussion, questions? Mr.
Can I
Dransfield.
just ask one question? Is that an aggregate, the 50,000, is that an aggregate, or is that kind of a per claim basis?
Per claim.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments, thoughts?
Just one question.
Yes, ma'am.
Anything that's not approved by Mr. King, will we get a listing of what has been approved by the Director of Risk Management at some point?
Yes, ma'am, we can do that.
Okay, thank you.
That'd be good, probably for us at least to know what's been approved. Other comments, questions? Seeing none, hearing none, we have a motion that's been made, a second also. All in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion passed unanimously. We'll move on to item 3C, consider selling of furniture located at 8035 East R.L. Thornton Freeway. Mr. King.
We're currently leasing a building across the street at about $35,000 a month. The lease is paid through December 31. I want to stop those payments, so we want to get all our furniture out of there. We don't need the furniture, so I got one offer to buy the furniture from Dallas ISD for $71,058.75. That's really about $50,000 more than we thought we would get at auction. Mr. Coulter and I thought we could get at auction, and that's about 70% of what we paid for the furniture originally, the new stuff. The old stuff has very little value, so we're recommending that we authorize this sale to Dallas ISD. I normally wouldn't sell without going out for bid, but we got to get the furniture out before they lock the doors.
Speed is somewhat important. I would like to point out that Dr. Hinojosa has kindly stepped away from the dais while we discuss and consider this item. Recommendation's been made. Is there a motion?
I move for approval of selling the furniture to the ISD.
Mrs. Spencer's made motions.
Second.
Second from Mr. Dransfield. Discussion, questions? Anyone?
Mr. King,
Greg?
when was the furniture originally purchased?
Beg your pardon?
When was the furniture originally purchased?
Within the last year.
Okay.
We still had the purchase order for the items, and they were a little over 100,000 for the items that were new. The old items, I don't know how long they've been in there.
Any other questions? Comments? We have a motion and a second to dispose of this furniture. I think you all know we're in the business of liquidating, so appreciate the efforts being made in that way. All in favor of the motion, would you signify by saying aye? Aye. Opposed, same side. That recommendation motion passes unanimously. The next item, 3D, is to consider approval of the contract for legal services for this committee. Mr. King, would you like to speak to that?
I've reviewed the proposal, and I'm in agreement that we should engage Thompson Horton for this job, and would recommend you approve the engagement.
The engagement letter begins on page 11 in your agendas. Would there be any questions or comments? Yes, sir, Mr. Dransfield.
Mr. Chairman, if I might suggest we try to revisit just a little bit and rework the waiver language they've got in here. It's a little bit broad, I think, in some respects. So I'm fine with the concept we have, as long as we're operating, which they are, in accordance with the rules of professional ethics. And so I would be supportive of the contract with a little bit of a modification to that to address the waiver issues from a conflict perspective, potentially.
Do we need to make that amendment now, or when would be?
I'm fine with authorizing Mr. King to go ahead and work with the attorneys to get that buttoned up and go ahead and proceed and act on this action today.
Okay. David, any observations you want to make?
We spoke briefly about that prior to the meeting, and we'll certainly be willing to tweak the language in the conflict section.
So we can improve the letter of engagement with your amendments. Are you comfortable with that?
Yes, sir, I am.
With Mr. King and Mr. Thompson working out the amendments, I think, to make sure that we've got those concerns addressed. Any other questions or comments with regard to the contract? I don't have a motion as of yet, but I wanted to get that comment on the table. Would anybody care to make a motion?
So moved.
Have a motion by the Vice Chair to approve the engagement.
I'll second.
Dr. Burns has seconded. Now, any other comments, questions, observations? Hearing none, I'll ask for the vote. All those in favor, would you signify by saying aye?
Aye.
Opposed? Same sign. Hearing none, that letter of engagement has passed unanimously with the chair not voting. David, I want to thank you and Carlos very much for helping us in what I think we all know is our uncharted waters. We are in an area here that I don't think any of us have had any experience, but we want to do this well. In order to do this well, we need good counsel, and we very much appreciate y'all being willing to be of assistance.
Honored to work with you.
Next item on the agenda is 3E. Consider providing notice to terminate lease at 8035 East R.L. Thornton Freeway. Mr. King, you want to speak to that item?
Yes, sir. This lease has nothing to do with safe and dependable transportation of our students, and we're going to recommend terminating that lease, and we're already getting all of our stuff out of the building and plan to make no further payments on that lease, and would like your authority to do so.
Have a recommendation. Is there a motion?
Motion.
Mr. Ringo's made the motion.
Second.
Second from Dr. Parra. Any discussion, questions?
Judges, I want to
Dr. Hinojosa.
thank Mr. King for looking at every possible expenditure avoidance that we can to try to make a smooth finish to the year. So thank you for doing that, Mr. King.
Thank you.
Mr. Stansfield.
I just want to encourage you to make sure we're looking at the termination timing, make sure that we're consistent with our contractual agreement that we have in place with them. So it looks to me like there may be a 60-day timing as opposed to a 30-day timing, so we just got to be mindful of that. So
Yes, sir, I'm working with David and on that issue.
We'll review the lease.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Other questions or comments? Anyone? Hearing no other questions or discussions, all those in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Hearing none, the motion passes unanimously. And we're ready to move to discussion items. Discussion item 4A is financial update. Members of the committee, I'm sure you know this will probably be a moving, floating update. And I think Mr. King, we all know, has a monumental task. As Dr. Hinojosa said, he's trying to reduce expenditures and trying to make sure that we meet obligations, specifically with the idea of safe, dependable transportation for the students for the remainder of this year being job one. So in any event, Mr. King, we will be happy to hear from you with regard to the financial update.
The presentation starts on 109, and it's going to be behind us, and some of us can't see behind us, so, I'm going to be working from the script I have here in front of me. So if you have any questions, just let me know. We're going to start on page 109. Basically, we'll go to 110. The 2017 approved budget had an operating deficit of $7.9 million. The budget was $42 million less than the previous year's budget, but $29 million of that reduction was tied to capital outlay. There's no capital outlay in this budget, so that kind of gets your bus replacement schedule behind. About $6 million of that reduction was due to the elimination of 3 school districts, White Settlement, Weatherford, and Capel. About 48 positions were cut sometime in January or February, which is $2 million. And then the balance of it is basically still those enterprise funds where the revenue and expenditures are in and out more or less in the same amount.
I want us to all have a chance to be sure you see and got a picture of what we're dealing with here. Before he moves on to the next slide, any questions there?
I have a question.
Matt?
Real
Yes,
quick.
sir,
Could
Mr.
you
Bowles.
speak to with some granularity, go back to the next slide, I'm sorry, proprietary revenue, and maybe speak to what that entails?
Yes, sir. It may be easier as I go through the presentation. I'm going to focus on all the revenues.
Okay, great. Perfect.
Because the expenditures, basically what's going to happen is any expenditures that are excess or under budget are going to be handled at settle up with the district. So they're either going to pay me more or pay me less than we have already billed them for. So I'll go through that. If I don't answer your question, then we'll try again. I'm going to flip to page 112, which is the first chart. We have revenue by object. And basically about 66% of our 2016-17 budget came from local sources, which is basically property taxes and contributions from the districts. In 2017-2018, it was 73%. That's on page 113. On page 115, you'll see that about 76% of our 2016-17 budget is tied up in property and on payroll and debt. And capital outlay was 16% of that budget. When you flip over to 17-18, capital outlay is basically down to zero. On page 117, at June 30th, 2017, The unrestricted fund balance, the total unrestricted fund balance had a deficit of 4.6 million. That's the beginning balance. And the general fund, the governmental fund, had a operating surplus of $7.9 million. However, the only reason we had an operating surplus of $7.9 million at year end was because we went out and sold another $11.3 million worth of our assets. So had we not sold a building for $11.3 million, we would have had a deficit in the governmental fund, restricted fund balance also at June 30th, 2017. Page 118 is basically the unaudited financial statement, which shows the governmental deficit or governmental unrestricted surplus of $7 million. But if you notice, total fund balance was $15 million, but that's actually going to be adjusted because we had loaned about $7 or $8 million to the Stop Arm program. They're not going to be able to pay it back. So the unrestricted deficit of $7 million is where we need to start with. On page 119, this is our enterprise funds, which is basically our Stop Arm program. You'll notice it had a operating unrestricted deficit of $12 million. One thing this does, and I kind of will caution everybody with, is this page assumes that we'll be able to sell all of our assets at book value. So it's actually probably going to be worse than this, because if you look up to the top of the page, you'll see that we have about $16 million in inventory, and that's for basically Stop Arm cameras that are spread all over the country, including Canada. I doubt that they have a value of $16 million if we can retrieve them all. $19 million of our assets is tied up in the intangible asset, where we went out and purchased the right to sell Stop Arm cameras in the state of Texas, so I doubt that we'll be able to get $19 million for that. So this particular fund is probably really going to be in the hole if we ever convert it to market value, or when we try to convert it to market value upon dissolution. We'll flip over to page 120. We've already talked about this. The operating deficit was $8 million. And then since then, budget amendment number 1 was approved, which increased the operating deficit by another $1 million for the election expense, which was not budgeted. So if you turn to page 121, you'll see that the total operating deficit is projected to be $13.5 million at year end if we spend every penny in the budget and receive every penny in the budget. And the governmental fund would have a deficit of $1.1 million. Page 122, consequences of unrestricted deficit fund balance, the lack of cash to cover current operating needs. You know, we're in that situation now. We're floating checks, a need to reprioritize spending so that we can address the organization's purpose of safe and dependable schools, safe and dependable transportation, a need to obtain short-term financing, which they've already done, a need to liquidate fixed assets to generate cash, which basically they've already done too. We've only got 2 assets remaining, really, other than buses, 2 pieces of property, this building and one other, and lower bond ratings. So when I'm looking at these projections, the key issues that we're going to be looking at are the revenue projections included in the budget. Are they correct? So we'll flip over to page 125. And you'll see that the general fund revenue was decreased by $39 million. This trends our revenue, actual revenue trends from our financial statements. We'll flip over to page 127. What's included in this budget is property taxes. Property taxes increased by $3.4 million. I believe that estimate's overstated by about $500,000. If you take the levy that was approved, recently approved, and tax statements were billed on, adjust that by 98% collection rate, we'll have to reduce that number by about $500,000. If you'll flip over to page 130, this is the charges that we make to the districts for transportation services. They've reduced that estimate by $5.9 million. $1.8 million of that was a loss of Capel, so they then reduced it by $4.1 million. So the question I really have is why are we going to reduce the charges to districts when we have a deficit budget? And why are we going to consider that when we had to sell assets to come out in the black last year? So we'll be taking a close look at this, and this will, I'll try to adjust this to actual expenditures and give you an estimate of where we need to be at closeout. Page 132 gives you a history of monitor reimbursements. Last year we received 6.7. This year we reduced the budget to 6.2. Most of that's a result of eliminating Capel, which is a couple $100,000, so that estimate is probably reasonable. If you flip over to page 134, this is the history of charges we make for extracurricular revenue. Last year it was 7.8. This year they're projecting 8.2. Last year Capel was $220,000 of that. What was planned here was they were planning to implement a price increase for extracurricular travel. They did not do that, so we're going to have to adjust the budget down by another $500,000. Page 136, this is the history of the charges for activity fund buses, and you see through the history they've been around $400,000. This year they bumped it up to $900,000. Capel's also in that number, so we're going to have to reduce that estimate down by $450,000. Page 138. This is the history of our coach bus revenue. Over the years, we received $400,000 or $500,000. We've discontinued that service for this year, so no revenue is anticipated in the budget. We got those 13 buses sitting on a lot, and some of them are under a lease agreement. Page 140, this is a history of our E-rate revenue. You can see through the last few years, we've collected on the average about $800,000. They bumped the revenue up to about $1 million, so we'll need to adjust that estimate down to $242,000. Page 142, this is our crossing guard revenue history. This will be adjusted with a corresponding decrease in expenditures. Right now, we're budgeting about $5 million to pay crossing guards, and we're only receiving about $450,000 from the city. And we have this as a discussion item a little later on in the agenda. But if we eliminate the crossing guard service, we'll eliminate expenditures and a little bit of revenue. Page 144. This just basically shows you the $11.3 million of the assets they sold to keep their fund balance in the black last year. Had those assets not been sold last year, we would end up in a deficit in both the general fund and the enterprise funds. Page 146 shows the history of state revenue. The actuals in 2015, that's an error. They're basically all $20 million. That's pretty flat, so that estimate appears to be reasonable. Page 148. Last year they borrowed $23 million, $24 million to purchase buses and stop arms. Those proceeds are not in here. We're not doing that this year. Page 149 basically kind of gives you a recap of the major changes in the revenue from last year to what we have in this year's budget. And that's just in the general fund. Now we're going to start on page 150 and 151. We're going to start talking about the enterprise funds. On page 151, you'll see what we've done with in-county stop arm program. Basically, for the current year, we've got $2.8 million budgeted in revenue. There really is no current contract in place to collect this money or expend this money. So, I'm guessing that $2 million is going to be, we're going to have to reduce this estimate by $2 million, and that's another issue we'll be working with our attorneys on. You flip over to page 153. This is the out-of-county stop arm program. There was a contract in place where we were going to pay a couple million, and we were going to receive $5 million. To date, None of that $5 million has been received by the district, nor have we expended any of that money, so we'll have to make an adjustment on that. I think the program is still going on because I'm getting bills from municipalities wanting their share of the tickets, but we don't have appear to have a valid contract in place, and we'll have to address that. And it also may not meet the organization purpose. On page 155, out-of-county transportation service, which is part of the enterprise fund, they've decreased by $2.5 million, which is basically the result of losing White Settlement and Weatherford. Page 157, out-of-district state revenue for transportation is relatively constant. Page 159 shows you a history of the technology revenues. That technology out-of-district service was eliminated, so the revenue went from 1.9 million to 0. But going along with that, we eliminated $2.3 million worth of expenditures, so last year the general fund had to contribute $400,000 to this enterprise program. Page 160. The revenue shortfalls we've talked about going to require a budget amendment of $6.2 million. So after the amendment, the operating deficit for the year will be $15 million. The June 30th, 2000 unrestricted total deficit will be $19.6 million. The governmental fund deficit will be $7.1 million. Page 161 gives you a view of the budget amendment. Page 162, this is basically what I was talking about. The expenditures and revenues, the balance of the expenditures and revenues are basically going to have to be addressed at settle up, with the districts either contributing more or less. And I'm going to try to address settle up, try to get an estimate of settle up early in the year. The use of the resources must be reprioritized so that we can focus on safe and dependable transportation of our students. Outstanding debt has reduced our net position. And on page 163, you'll see what our total debt was as of December 1. Total debt was basically $144 million. If you look at lines 2 and 3, the 14 million and the 7.2 million, that's for 239 buses. And the last line, the 40 million, is for our bus garages in 4 locations. Page 164 gives you the recap of the payments that are due during December, and the tax anticipation notes that are due. What's our current cash position? Well, Dallas, we didn't borrow enough funds to resolve our cash flow issues. We're currently floating checks and timing those with the receipt of deposits from our taxes and our districts. There's also a clause in our escrow agreement for the tax anticipation notes where all of the tax money is basically supposed to go into an escrow account. If we do that, we don't have access to the tax revenues. We have not been doing that. The district had not started it. We're not in compliance with that portion of the agreement. If we paid all the debt and followed this agreement, we'd end up in the hole at the end of December, and cash would be short about $3.7 million. If our budget is 100% correct, it looks like we should have around $700,000 in cash at year end. However, we've already noted those other shortfalls, so I don't know how that's going to impact that $700,000 projection. Page 166 and 167 is our cash flow for the month. And then page 168 is our estimate of cash flow for the year. And Matt, did I answer your questions about enterprise revenues?
You did, thank you.
And that's kind of a rough presentation of where we're at today.
Rough is kind of the adjective to describe that a little bit in more ways than one, isn't it?
Yes, sir, it is.
Any questions, observations, comments?
You can't start with a deficit and have a deficit budget. I mean, we started with a deficit and we passed a deficit budget to start with. You just can't do that. Yes, sir.
Just, you know, I don't know how quick of a question this is, but going back to the obligations, the debt obligations on pages 163 and 4.
Yes, sir.
Which are essentially the same. What, if any, communication have you had with some of these creditors about the status of these payments?
No conversation.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to ask, as far as the rights to operate the Stop Arm program, was that a cash outflow, or was there debt associated with that intangible?
The cash, the debt associated with the Stop Arm program, the Stop Arm program receipts were supposed to cover the debt, and they
Okay.
never have.
Okay. Okay. And then on slide 62 as well, there's the last sentence. It says, in the past, this was accomplished at year ends via a settle up with the district, meaning that if we were short in revenues, additional bills were sent out to make up those shortfalls.
On page 62?
162,
162. You're talking about the last sentence in the first bullet?
Yes.
162.
So what happens at year end is we take all of our expenditures for transportation, and we determine how much the district is going to pay. So we're billing them at one rate, and we're expending at another rate.
Okay.
So at year end, we're going to have a reconciliation of what we're spending
Got
to
it.
what they're paying us. But I'm going to try to do that early so that I can start getting money. My goal is year end, no receivables, no payables, so we'll have to make that estimate early.
Okay. Okay. And then my last question, on slide 164, that Wilmington Trust, which debt is that associated with?
Ms. Miller, I don't know that we can hear you. If you could speak
Oh, I'm
in your
sorry.
microphone.
The Wilmington Trust on page 164, it's the last three wires. What is that?
Those are the tax anticipation notes.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Mr. King, would you speak to all of this again as it relates to meeting payroll again and meeting payroll immediately and as we go forward next spring?
We have to we have to hold enough money in cash to make sure I can make each payroll as it comes up. And we have to make sure that our districts are paying us timely and we're billing timely. And when those things don't line up, we'll run out of money I cannot meet payroll. So what we've been doing, we've been holding vendor checks to make sure I can meet each payroll. We've been calling selective districts to make sure we get our money. And, we just have to match it up. Now, had I been if we follow this escrow agreement and pay all this debt, we'll be out of money, won't be able to make payroll at the end of December. Now, by the end of the year, when we start getting our tax collections in, the situation gets a little bit better, but not much. It's going to be a constant balancing act between now and the end of the year. Did that answer that?
Yes, sir. Just, an observation is obviously, I think the charge from the legislature, the charge from from Senator Huffines is continue to be that the transportation needs of the children come first. And meeting these needs and making sure that these children are transported safely to the school districts that are represented here, I think is our first obligation. I acknowledge, I think all of us do, that there are other obligations, but I think you are proceeding down the correct path to meet the immediate obligations that we have with regard to transporting the students. I'm going to be very interested in, as soon as you can, in letting the districts know settle-up information, because that's going to be critical for their planning, for their next budget year, as well as their spring and this budget year. So that's going to be important, and I know you know that. Dr. Hinojosa, I saw you had a question.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, as a component district, the communications between our district and Mr. King and his team have improved significantly, but I would encourage you, Mr. King, to keep working with our team to give us notice of how soon our bills are due so that we can get as much revenue to you as quickly as possible. So I do appreciate the interim steps you've taken to make that a much better working agreement. but we need to pay our bills on time. And so if there are any glitches, please let me know, or Larry Throm or Scott Lane, in us executing our payments to you. And my other comment, is, and I don't expect an answer, don't want an answer. This is like one of my board members says, this is rhetorical. But long-term, the definition of debt is very critical. However, those four letters are defined, are very critical to all of our being and the being of this organization for the balance of this year. So I just need to put that on the record.
A good observation, timely, and one that I know that with our attorneys, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about going forward.
I would like to add one thing. We will not miss a payroll, so I don't want people leaving here thinking that they're not going to get paid. We'll miss other things, but we're not going to miss payroll.
Thank you for saying that. That makes me feel better, and I suspect everyone else. We know that there are people out there that are transporting these children every day, and fairness to them, safety for the children is first. Fairness to these people who provide that transportation and drive those buses is also essential to us as well. Other comments, questions with regard to what I think I said last meeting would be sobering, but anyone else want to ask any questions? Or I know we're going to see more information coming to us probably each meeting. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, sir.
Mr. King, as you move forward, and there'll be more updates with regard to the financial position of this organization, but I think everyone knows what obligations we're trying to meet first. I hope you concur with that. I haven't heard any dissents. I assume that you do. I'll ask one more time before we move on. Are there any other questions about the financial report? We'll move ahead and go to the next discussion items, discussion item B, with regard to the crossing guard contract. Mr. King.
We currently have an agreement with the City of Dallas where we provide crossing guards various locations. We spend about $5 million. They reimburse us about $400,000. At our next meeting, I'm going to recommend that we recommend we get out of that contract and stop that payment. And we've been trying to get in touch with the City of Dallas, but because I'd like to make the transition smooth, but if we can't make it smooth, we're probably just going to have to set a date and pull the trigger. So hopefully we can get that resolved and have a recommendation to you at the next meeting.
Questions, comments, any discussion?
So, Mr. King, if you're talking about dropping this contract, are you talking about those individuals having to be transferred over to city payrolls, or?
Yes, sir. There's about 400 crossing guards, just a little under 400. There's a few vacancies, about 400 crossing guards employed. And the city needs to move them over their payroll, and I don't want to leave them out in the cold. I'm hoping I can get some sort of agreement reached with the city. Haven't had much luck yet.
Okay.
We wish you well on that, and I think you're being prudent as well on trying to make that move as well. Any other questions, comments with regard to this item on school crossing guards? Hearing none, we'll move forward to discussion item 4C, the school year. Mr. King.
It appears that the committee has the authority to set the end date anytime from the last day of school till August 31. I've been meeting with our customers to see when they want us to provide this service. And right now, it looks like they want us to go through July. So I still have a few more to visit with. So at our next meeting, I'll be making a recommendation for you. So it looks like at this point in time, we'll recommend an end date of end of July, July 31.
Questions, discussion? I assume there's been already been some discussion about this, and you'll continue to work with the member districts to get that lined out, and we'll see this again.
Yes, sir.
Hearing no other discussion or comments, I'll go to information items. 5A, the Weaver report. Comments, Mr. King?
I really don't have any comments. We're just providing this report for your information. We spent $130,000 on the report, and I don't really want to spend any more money on it, so just getting out here for your information. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to address them.
Obviously, That's a report that we've seen, received. I don't know exactly how that affects our work. My comment has been our role, I think, as a dissolution committee has been to determine where we are now and what we need to do to go forward. What's already transpired, I think we have limited ability to deal with that, and I think others will have to make decisions in that arena. Any comments? Anything you want to say about it? I think we've moved through our action items, discussion items, information items. It is now 10:40. We will adjourn into executive session for purposes permitted by the Texas Open Meetings Act, Texas Government Code 551.001, including but not limited to sections 551.071, consultation with the attorney, 551.072, real property, 551.074, personnel matters, and as I say, the time is 9:40. I did call us in the meeting at 10 o'clock with a quorum present. We'll adjourn into executive session at this time. Are we meeting in the same place as last time? Okay. We'll move to executive session. Call the committee back in open session. It's 11:53. Thank members for their work. This time, I think we have some action we may need to take relative to item 7C.
I'll make a motion that we accept the contract from Mr. King.
Motion's been made that we accept a CEO employment agreement with Alan King. Is there a second?
Second.
Second made by, was that Kelly? I got Greg on the motion, Greg Buchanan on the motion, Kelly Spencer on the second. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Same sign. Hearing none, that motion is passed unanimously. Mr. King, thank you again. We appreciate you, appreciate the opportunity to work with you. I know you have a big task, but I'm grateful for your graciousness in working with us and coming to an agreement to work with this committee. Just one other observation. I want to thank everyone associated with all the organizations that are here. I'm particularly grateful to Dino, Kay, everybody associated with DISD, Scott, Jack, everyone. Thank you for your support of the committee and our work. For those employees that are here for Dallas County, thank you for your work. Thank you for your service. I want to reiterate that the work that's being done, particularly with regard to service to students, transportation to students, by our bus drivers and other support personnel is greatly appreciated, greatly needed. This committee is going to work very hard to make sure that we can have a great transition as we have dissolution of this organization into the work that the school districts do. But we express our gratitude to everyone, and we give honor to your work. Any other quick comments, closing comments? Hearing none, we're adjourned.